waste management decision that he was going to make. And I think just more communication at an informal level or outside of the venues of the planners is important.
I'm glad you said that. I'm going to put my ranger hat on now. Because we talk about a planning process where we've got requirements and we've got science that's necessary for the bigger decisions and to defend our plans. But quite frankly, as a land manager and as a ranger, I was responsible and my staff was responsible for making decisions each and every day. If we anticipated unacceptable impacts occurring, or they were occurring. And tell me, from your perspective, does the science need to be done first before I make that decision?
I don't think it's realistic to always have the science, but I think to the extent that the science is there, we all have an obligation to make sure it's that everyone's aware of it. But I think we have to make decisions in the absence of the best information because we rarely have it. But I do think it's imperative that what science is available is in the process.
I mean, we have two entities, each set up on a different fundamental premise. They have different objectives entirely. You know, if you set up your science to implement policy, you're just a collection of information. Same thing, the management is not that a set of priorities are given to you. And that either as a professional, the overlapping positive, intertwining objectives and accountable obstacles, you never get to do this type of thing. So it seems like fundamentally it's a communication problem. And very few people have exceptional communication skills. I mean, if anyone says they don't have disputes with their, significant other, they would be an expert and probably lying. So it seems like if we were to try and get those to talk better, we might look at figuring out who is best at communicating and use that as a vehicle to work interdisciplinary. And it doesn't have to be one field or one group to another. And it sounds like those are already happening. If those professional facilitators are there in these meetings, I mean, that sounds like a good step to replicate.
Let me throw in a third player in this dialogue, though, and that's the public. And I could speak from working on the management plan for the Tahoe Basin, but it was such a horrible experience that I would rather talk about Peru, which is more recent and I'm more hopeful about. Last year, the Peruvian Park Service in Juarez and other entities sponsored a glacier conference in Juarez, which is a city of 100,000 at the foot of the Cordillera Blanca in northern Peru, and invited the public to come in and learn about their glaciers. And the idea was to start educating and starting the dialogue with farmers, city dwellers, visitors, tourists, scientists, NGOs. It was a pretty mixed audience about the state of the glaciers in that part of Peru. And the reason why it's important is that not only are they a major source of water to a desert country, but they're losing glacial mass at a huge rate. Plus, they've got these GLOFs, as they're called, glacier lake outburst floods, that in the past have wiped out whole cities, and very suddenly so. Nepal has a lot of the same problems. So a lot of what the value of this dialogue was, which is now going to start informing, going backwards and informing the planning in the park and some of the politics in the region, is that now the farmers are aware of a lot of the science that is going on and they've gotten interested. They don't want GLOFs, they want to know something more about their water supply. They're actually hungry for knowledge. And these are not necessarily people with college degrees. These are people who are very closely tied to the landscape they live in. So we're finding that there's a desire for science, but there's also now a desire on their part to say, I have this knowledge, I want to know more, I want the scientists to tell us more. And they can use that as a tool in the political process. can't say that's true here in the US, but that may also show a path in other parts of the world where, you know, you've got these horrible water resource issues that are coming up suddenly. And that's where science can make a big difference in how, in the case of Peru, it gets through this big transition.
One thought, you know, is the level of the question and the level of the problem. If it's something like the poo melting out of the glaciers, that's obviously very imminent. If it's something like the project that I'm leading, which is the water supply, essentially looking at the impacts of pollution on the glaciers and which is affecting the long-term water supply, the big issues are potentially 10, 20, 30 years down the road. That's when the glacier-fed rivers are going to start going dry, you know, something like that. Potentially a little faster, a little slower, depending on what's going on. There's several potential in the case of this project. The first question is to figure out if there's a problem. You know, we have the luxury, potentially the luxury of time and being able to figure out that problem and the fact that it's not affecting us right now immediately, so we can figure out if there is a problem and then figure out how to address the problem. And, you know, in some cases, obviously, time is really critical. In some cases, you know, they don't necessarily think, the local people, managers may not necessarily think that there's a problem or think that there's anything that they can do about it. And that's where the science first technique really, you know, really is pretty important. You know, but the action first, obviously, don't put your poo there is obviously a very important and depending on the problem. So I think there's very different levels there to the different answers to the question.
The sweep of the science that we're talking about is so,
yes.
The scales are at such huge differences.
Yes.
You know, the stuff you were talking about, I'm an applied scientist trying to deal with very specific visitor impact managements in very specific places. And we design our science directly to answer a question a planner wants to know. You know, a relationship between use and an impact, or a relationship between a regulation and an impact, something like that. And I've worked in some big parks, kind of like Paul's Denali. I've worked in Grand Canyon and Yosemite, sometimes under threat of lawsuit or a lawsuit guiding the work, where we had lots of money and we could do lots of research and inform lots of questions. And then I've worked in places where there's no money, and it's kind of like what you got out at Wrangles. And, you know, what are you going to do then? And one of the answers is, I have no science, therefore I can't make a decision. And I think that's the danger zone for what I do, is that they say, oh, we don't have any information, we haven't monitored, I can't even contemplate something here. And I think that because a lot of the things we do are cumulative impacts or impacts that once they're bad, it's hard to turn back the clock, you gotta be careful about that. So I think sometimes you have to use professional judgment, think ahead. The places that did that, in some ways, did pretty well, and they sometimes did it because some scientist was warning them. Kind of like the early climate change scientists were warning all of us. We still haven't even listened, but anyway.
Thank you. How about some questions from the audience?
Do any of you have an example of where local peoples were involved in the science, where you gave them directions, they worked with you, and then you left and they continued a project? You know of any? Where, for example, some of the folks in this room might be interested in that, where, because you can't obviously live in these places all the time, but they could continue something with far-off guidance?
There's,
Oh, yeah.
who wants to go first?
Well, I mean, you and I have worked on a project.
Oh, yes.
So,
I guess I'd call myself, I'm thinking more of something that, yeah, definitely. You're Canadian and Alaskan, so.
true.
Yeah. But I know nothing about, and you're giving me full guidance, yeah.
Are you presenting on that?
Yeah.
Okay, so I won't spoil it.
No, you could mention it, yeah.
Well, so a lot of my PhD research was on human waste management systems, actual like toilet systems to manage human waste, waterless remote sites. And some of there was a company called Ecosphere, and now it's Sanisphere, who is presenting tomorrow. And They have a urine diverting vermicomposting toilet, and so I investigated that and compared it to North American systems. I'm presenting that research, but one of the processes that came out of that was the benefits of diverting urine away from fecal matter and managing the two streams separately. I mean, ultimately, physiologically, we source separate ourselves, and so some of the other waste management practices have built into them a source separation, such as the clean mountain cans that Roger runs. So there is a source of this relatively pure fecal matter that you guys take it to a wastewater treatment plant, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of management of that material. As it comes out of the can, it goes into a barrel or a tank, a holding tank, and it goes into a septic truck, and it gets dumped at the wastewater treatment plant. And there's even questions about, is the wastewater treatment plant the best thing in a lot of these smaller northern communities? So one of the projects that Roger and I got mutually interested in was vermicomposting source separated human waste out of the CMC cans. And we've gone back and forth since the last conference. You know, an email or two a month, lab analyses, and Roger is doing all the work and sending the samples, and I'm helping. And it was effective, I think, really quite effective. But it was a unique pairing with similar interests. So it seems like to make that work in other areas, seems like there needs to be that body. Some body that finds, has a database of scientists and has a database of people needing technical expertise and melds the two together and manages outcomes and expectations.
Yeah, and I'm not a scientist at all. I'm a climber, so pretty much my whole life helping people climb, and dealing with this waste stuff has been like an eye-opener.
So, does anybody know of a body that, I mean, speaking of it, some comes to mind having spoken about it before, but there must be some bodies out there that join citizen groups to scientists.
Yeah, well, so water quality monitoring is a pretty big deal for volunteers. Like Trout Unlimited has people collecting macroinvertebrates and stuff in the streams and shipping them off or doing their own counts, things like that. And I think sometimes those get on automatic pilot and people do them for forever, even after the scientists have long lost interest.
Bird counts.
Bird counts, yeah, the Christmas bird count, that's one. So I think there are examples like that.
There's, the Mountain Institute has their Sherpa Science Plan where they're doing program where the Sherpas are doing in Nepal doing water quality sampling. I'm working with a group that they were doing glacier measurements in the Cordillera Blanca for 20 years. They've been doing this, and they just ran out of funding. And I'm actually picking up the funding because they're doing now doing black carbon measurements. So we're getting black carbon measurements year round, which until now we've just had data from the dry season. I've got that going there. I'm trying to get university groups, students in various different places. I've got some people interested in Cusco, some people in La Paz, Bolivia, who are going to be doing stuff like that. And yeah, that's scientists, not necessarily citizen science, but the guy doing the glacier measurements in Cordillera Blanca, he's getting a little pay for it, but yeah, he's been doing it for 20 years, he and his family. So I think there's programs like that can exist, and especially in lower financial areas, it can be pretty inexpensive to get good quality measurements. If it's water quality or what I'm doing with the snow samples. So.
Did you have a question back here?
Yeah. Maybe not so much a question as an encouragement. I mean, the projects I'm running, I mean, we have also been using kind of volunteers to do research that haven't been scientists at all. And as a matter of fact, actually the group we put together for Everest came from different subjects, including some kind of natural sciences. So
Roger, how are we doing on time? We have some more questions.
Yeah, let's go with some more questions. This is
Okay,
good stuff.
good, yeah.
Another good example of what you were talking about is the raptor monitor in this country. A lot of that was developed by scientists, and then local communities have just taken it over. It's been monitored for decades, just with volunteers. And I think it ties back to the question you asked at the beginning: is what drives what, and having the community monitor raptors and understand behavior patterns of raptors then allows them to understand why it's important to comply with certain things and comply with closures, affects the behavior, and sort of the cycle that makes the system sort of work and improve over time. I think there's several examples in the common community with people sort of taking ownership of science and then checking in with agencies and scientists and go back again.
Very good. The stewardship programs come to mind. Somebody else back here? Yes, sir.
Just to echo what Marcus said about encouragement. As an environmental professional, as somebody who actually sort of took that to work in the outdoors, in the wilderness areas, I see a lot of prospective expeditioners coming to us with, which I disparagingly refer to as pseudoscience, and they use these projects to raise the funding to come down. Obviously, where we operate, it's very expensive to get there. So people actually want to be able to sell their project. But really, that is actually what they want to do, is have an adventure and back that up or justify it with some science. It gets a bit frustrating to see that. When you look around this room, how much knowledge there is. There's people here who are serious environmental professionals who actually, obviously are serious outdoors people as well. And I think that actually having a body that can actually coordinate this in some way, or can actually just to represent it. I think in mountain areas, it would be like really significant. There is an organisation like that that works in the polar areas. I think it's called APEX, the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists. And these are people who actually like maybe they're studying something, or they want to be affiliated. Maybe it could be a social scientist, a social science, or a art physical science, and they actually work on other projects. So it actually has an actual outcome, because then it's, we've all seen it. You can just go on the internet and you will see many examples of expeditions that are sort of pushing some kind of science, and it isn't at all. And I think it's important for us to be honest about that. Often we justify going to these places because we want to go there, and we try and justify it by coming up with some reason. With all the energy and the enthusiasm, it would be very good to get mentorship and to get direction and leadership, so you do get something concrete out at the end of the day.
Great comment. Thank you.
Couple of things in response to that. I totally agree with that. So when we ask for citizen scientists, we still imagine that there's a PI, a principal investigator somewhere else directing that science. The thing you're talking about is where the expedition is formed around their own scientific ideas, and they're the PI. And whether that's good or bad, I mean, I think it's often what you say is, it's pseudoscience. It may not be real, so be careful about that. But the other thing that reminds me of with you, because you're one of those unique operators that's really interested in pro-environment behaviors, the guides that do return trips, they may be their best citizen scientists yet, and we could possibly, meaning agencies or the commons or whatever, could make them do that work as a privilege for being able to guide there. And so I think there's some opportunity there over the long haul that agencies are not taking advantage of. Having said that, in Grand Canyon, we tried to get the Grand Canyon guides to do stuff for us, and we couldn't make them do it. But in Grand Canyon, the guides kind of run the park, so in some ways that's why. But again, you've got to make sure that the thing you're asking them to do is something they can do and still get their other stuff done. And so that's the key there.
That kind of gets into the technicalities in terms of permitting.
Right.
Sorry, Carl.
One quick comment, and I hate to make the sales pitch here, but kind of along those lines, I'm starting up a little program to try to do monitoring along all of the Andes to get black carbon measurements along all the Andes with the techniques that I developed with the ACSP. And so it's nice and easy techniques, getting people who are going down climbing to the Andes. I'll send you the gear, show you how to use it, get it back at the end, and guides potentially in different areas could be an incredible resource for something like that. This is something that I've talked to Ellen and Kenny about different aspects of the project that we can actually work into it to get the most bang for the buck as far as on the social side, understanding people's motivations, why they're going where and stuff like that, and on the scientific side, so we can get a, one of the big problems is there pretty much hasn't been any look at black carbon in all of South America on the glaciers, except for the ACSP measurements. So I'm working with an international community down in South America, and we're trying to expand that. And this is one of the ideas that we had, just get citizen scientists and potentially guides and stuff, and people like that to potentially help us out with this type of project. So, sorry for the pitch.
Great. Well, obviously, we're running into lunchtime here. I encourage you to continue these conversations and questions for our panelists out at lunch and in the hallways and days to come. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay, let's take a lunch. We'll be back at 1 o'clock.